If the 2000s could be remembered for anything, it is arguably just one simple word: innovation. Despite a very heated and turbulent political climate that frankly created a nihilistic outlook on the world, it was a time where many people found an escape through the ever-growing World Wide Web. Its popularity was just compounding as the years went on, but this new domain of communication was still very much in its infancy, and we see this reflected in the new technologies of the time, particularly the very strange ones. At least they are strange in the sense that these trends and ideas were once seen as incredibly attractive and useful for the time, but have largely been forgotten today. In other words, the 2000s took the technology of the 90s and made it so much better, focusing on a sense of individualism and diversity that gave people the luxury to create their own space, their own future. In many respects, this is a vision of technology that I believe has largely faded in recent time. Today, we're going to talk about the technological trends of the 2000s that have since died out, but continue to make this decade distinct in its own right. Now, the first trend that immediately stands out about the technology of this decade actually involves a physical trait. Of course, I am talking about the massive popularity of plastic. Although it started in the 90s, this was a fad that lasted well into the 2000s, particularly through all the new gadgets that were popping up left and right. Aesthetics was certainly a huge part of it, but there was also a practical component to it as well. You see, plastic was seen as something much more cost-efficient than something like paper. It was also much more water-resistant. It lasted much longer. It felt like a no-brainer for a lot of companies to switch over to it. So instead of paper grocery bags, you now had plastic grocery bags. Instead of paper cups, you now had plastic cups, and so on. Now, plastic certainly existed decades before, and this is a trend that goes as far back as the 1960s. But as technology for making plastic got better and it became cheaper and faster to create, its presence was only orders of magnitude larger by the time the 90s rolled around. On top of that, plastic also just looks really cool. It has a sleek, shiny, almost chrome look to it when it is done right. This was something that the iMac perfected in 1998, and it pretty much set the standard for how most electronics would look going forward. The color of plastic that arguably stands out the most from this era is white. You had the first iPod, multiple versions of the iMac, the Nintendo Wii, Nintendo DS, among other things. The clean, almost minimalist look that white had really embodied that futuristic look that the 2000s was trying to capture. It was the new millennium, so it only made sense for people to focus on creating a better future, despite many of the disorderly real-world events that were often happening around them. It was almost like a Jetsons version of the future. But of course, white was not the only color. This plastic trend also came in a flavor that focused on choice. You could even choose the color of your plastic device. This was a trend that also became popular with the 1998 iMac, and it came in the form of many laptops at the time. The Nintendo DS was another device that allowed the user to choose their color, and even just video game consoles in general. Another aspect of these plastic electronics that stands out to me is that they also expressed their individualism through other means. They primarily did this through making devices that were overly proprietary. An example of this would be those Nickelodeon toys that played episodes of certain Nicktoons, and the device was intentionally themed to essentially create this Nickelodeon exclusive world. There was one toy that I remember having as a kid that would play episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants, and at the end of each episode you had to answer a trivia question about SpongeBob in order to get to the next episode. I have yet to remember the name of it, but this is an example of what I am talking about. If you remember this toy, let me know in the comments. So, in addition to being practical, plastic was able to develop its own style that made it stand out at this time. This sleek, glossy look wasn't just expressed physically, it was also expressed through software. There was a trend at the time for operating systems and websites to feature buttons in Windows that had very realistic, textured looks to them. Retrospectively, people have called this style Frutiger Arrow, but that is a much more specific example, and I've already talked about it on my channel in the past. Instead, I want to focus on the umbrella term for this concept, skeuomorphism. As we've discussed before, this look came about as the result of the rendering capabilities of personal computers rapidly growing by the end of the 90s. The product that significantly popularized this trend would be Mac OS X from 2000, which introduced its Aqua interface. This ditched the more archaic, flat 90s look that Mac OS IX had in favor of shiny buttons and scroll bars that resembled little water droplets, hence the name. Naturally, other software followed a similar approach, like Windows XP and then later Windows Vista. One of my favorite examples of this would be the old YouTube layouts. Look at the gradient buttons and almost metallic windows that contain each widget on the webpage. It almost feels like something you could reach out and grab. That's what she said. You also had the gorgeous eye candy that was Mac OS X Snow Leopard, which further added to the Aqua design. By the time the 2010s came around, skeuomorphism started to die out in favor of flat design. Although this design has stayed alive in some other areas. In fact, Fidelity's website had this exact look up until very recently. In addition to CGI improving throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, another theory for why skeuomorphism was so popular was because of user conditioning. With the popularity of technology exploding in the 90s, this meant a lot of people using it for the first time that felt intimidated by it. Well, the best way to make technology easy to understand is by making it look like something familiar. Having it resemble something from the real world. This is what the iPad's library app iBooks looked like. It looks like something from the real world, such as a bookshelf. So the user now knows what to do and how to navigate their content. As people got conditioned to using these devices, they could now get less hand-holdy and create more minimalist designs that used up less resources. And so flat design came instead. Again, this is just a theory, but it could be a great way to make using technology less of a headache. And the last thing you need is headaches. I wish there was some kind of website where you could share videos. Too bad there isn't. But that's okay, because I can always share my favorite moments on my own website, thanks to Squarespace. Squarespace is an easy-to-use website builder designed both for personal and professional use, and it can all be done in one place. Their innovative tool known as Design Intelligence gathers decades of popular design trends to provide a website theme made just for you. And you can always make your own changes to it later if you want to. For those who run their own business or want to get started on their own business, Squarespace is just the platform. They provide their own payment portal that you can add to your website to sell your products and services, which supports a wide variety of payment options. When you're all ready to go, all you have to do is set up your Squarespace domain name, and now you are live to the whole world. And the greatest part, you don't even need any experience to get started. With just a few clicks, I guess you could say you're in a class of your own. I'll have to change that one. Hop on to squarespace.com for a free trial and then head to squarespace.com/nationsquid to get 10% off your purchase of a website or domain name. Going back to that sense of individualism, it also took form through the 2000s' huge emphasis on website customizability. Now, this was already popular in the 90s thanks to things like GeoCities, AngelFire, and Flash Player, which allowed people to create pretty much anything they wanted as long as they knew what they were doing. This trend only got bigger the following decade as computers became more commonplace. A big component of this was something called cascading style sheets, or CSS for short. It was a computer language that complemented HTML by essentially laying out instructions that presented a page in a certain way. CSS was particularly popular with MySpace pages. If you were good enough with coding, you could fill your page with a bunch of colors, cool animations, and even have music playing in the background. CSS gave people so much choice, in fact, that it was even used to create a computer virus that specifically spread on MySpace. I've done a video about that story as well. YouTube took great inspiration from the MySpace page layout and implemented it into their YouTube channel layouts. While this didn't have the same level of CSS customizability that MySpace did, it still gave users the option to customize their page's color, change their backgrounds, and even ditch the color altogether and add a texture instead. Any kind of texture. But as smartphones became popular, these pages looked much less appealing and were even much harder to use on such a small screen. So, these types of customizable web pages eventually became obsolete, and more uniform, mobile-friendly websites took over. This emphasis on the individual was so popular because the internet and technology in general was seen as something that should be decentralized. Another trend that was, again, from the 90s that embraced this concept was online piracy. Napster was the program that essentially normalized it in pop culture. But Napster would only let you pirate music. This is because music files were tiny and therefore much easier to transmit over dial-up internet. But as internet technology got better in the 2000s, so did file sharing, with a whole new technology popping up in 2001, BitTorrent. In short, BitTorrent was a protocol that allowed you to download relatively large files in a decentralized manner, even if you didn't have the best internet connection. Instead of just pirating music, you could now pirate movies, TV shows, video games, even entire computer programs. Other programs like LimeWire and Kazaa would also enter the picture as alternative peer-to-peer file sharing applications that effectively acted as better replacements to Napster. This growing capability created a moral panic that fought against online piracy. The most notable and humorous examples being those PSAs that played at the beginning of tapes and DVDs. You wouldn't download a car. But then piracy arguably lost a lot of its appeal thanks to the rise of convenient platforms such as streaming and the whole SOPA controversy from 2011, which I think should be its own separate video. Though with many of the highly contentious decisions streaming companies have been making in recent time, this is one trend that I could very well see coming back in a similar form. And lastly, one of my favorite tech trends of the 2000s would be customizable ringtones. During the era of iPods and MP3s, particularly before the advent of smartphones, it was quite common for people to take snippets of their favorite songs and make them their ringtone. You could even change the ringtone for each individual person. This was a popular feature on Blackberries, and there were even entire websites where you could buy your own ringtones and download them directly to your phone. I was one of the people who even participated in this trend at the time. For a long time, my ringtone was the guitar solo in Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. It was great. Now, of course, the technology for this is obviously still around. You can still add customizable ringtones to your iPhone, for example. But it isn't exactly the easiest thing to do. You often have to plug it in your computer and then download third-party apps and then have to personally go in and trim the file to under 30 seconds. It's sort of a hassle. If you're not tech savvy, it just doesn't seem like something that's worth it. Not to mention, there's also a growing trend right now, particularly among people my age, where they just have their phones on silent forever. What's with that? What if your phone gets lost and you have to call it? How could you live like that? Now, I want to be clear and say that these trends are not exclusive to the 2000s, and you could certainly find examples of them existing today. Additionally, these are not the only tech trends that existed at this time, but rather the ones that I believe stood out the most and defined that era. It is very well possible that some of these could even make a comeback. Only time will tell. If you would like to see my video about that computer virus that destroyed MySpace, you can find it here. A special thanks to all my Patreon supporters, patreon.com/nationsquid, and buying me a coffee is always very much appreciated. Thank you for watching.